The Baltic Sea lay still under a muted sky, its surface reflecting a cold metallic sheen that seemed almost symbolic of the world that was about to emerge from it. Far from the eyes of civilians, behind guarded fences and layers deceptions woven by the Reich, something enormous was taking shape, something that would redefine naval warfare and shake the foundations of European power. It began as lines on a blueprint, as whispers in engineering halls, as coded reports exchanged between admirals, but soon it would become steel, thunder, and destiny. Germany, humiliated after the First World War, had lived 2 decades under restrictions that strangled its naval ambition. The Treaty of Versailles had not only limited its fleet, but had wounded its pride. Yet pride, when wounded, often grows into obsession. And for the leaders of the new regime rising in Berlin, the sea represented more than strategy. It represented vindication. The industrial heart of Germany was ordered to beat faster, louder, and more secretly than ever before. The Bismarck began as a response to that obsession. The shipyards at Blom and Voss in Hamburg transformed into a hive of feverish activity. Workers toiled day and night, welding beams the size of cathedral columns, assembling armor plates so thick they seemed carved from mountains. Engineers whispered to each other as they inspected the hull, a structure that looked less like a ship and more like a floating fortress. Every centimeter was designed with a mixture of precision, paranoia, and ambition. The ship would be named after Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, who had forged the German Empire. A name chosen not just by coincidence, but by intention. This was not just a vessel, it was a message. While the British believed their Royal Navy remained untouchable, German engineers believed the world had changed. A new era required a new kind of warship, fast enough to outrun what it couldn't beat, strong enough to destroy anything that dared approach, and enduring enough to become a moving citadel on the open ocean. As the keel was laid, the Bismarck was already breaking rules set by the Allies. It exceeded displacement limits, armor thickness, gun caliber, and engine power. But secrecy was part of the design itself. German intelligence worked tirelessly to hide the ship's true scale. Reporters were misled. Foreign agents were shadowed. Photographs were manipulated. And all the while, inside the shipyard, the monster grew. Its armor belt was so thick that some workers joked it could survive a collision with a mountain. Its engines, buried deep within a labyrinth of compartments, would push the ship past 30 knots. A speed unthinkable for something of its size. 12 boilers roared like chained beasts, feeding turbines designed to propel a floating city across the world's oceans.
But nothing commanded more attention than its main armament, 8 380mm guns housed in 4 massive turrets. Each could hurl a shell weighing more than a small car across dozens of kilometers. When engineers tested the recoil calculations, veteran machinists shook their heads. No ship had ever carried a punch like this. As the hull took form, rumors reached London and then spread through the Admiralty like a winter storm. Intercepted reports described an unprecedented vessel, a new class of threat, a super battleship. British analysts debated whether the threat was real or exaggerated. Yet one thing was certain. If the Bismarck ever sailed into open waters, it could tear apart entire convoys, disrupt Atlantic lifelines, and challenge the Royal Navy's centuries-old dominance. In Berlin, Hitler took a personal interest in the ship's construction. He visited the shipyard, walking past towering cranes and mountains of steel plates. When he stood beneath the half-finished hull, dwarfed by its height, witnesses said he stared at it with something close to awe, an emperor beholding his new crown. Workers on the scaffolding stopped what they were doing. For a moment, silence filled the shipyard. Hitler placed his gloved hand on the steel frame and said simply, "This ship will bring fear to our enemies." It was not a blessing, it was a prophecy. As the Bismarck neared completion, its interior began to take shape, a maze of compartments designed to keep the ship fighting even when crippled. Corridors long enough to swallow echoes, gunrooms that smelled of oil and steel, crew quarters arranged like barracks compressed inside a fortress, and deep below, armored decks designed to survive torpedoes and plunging fire. Life aboard the Bismarck, even before its maiden voyage, felt strangely ritualistic. Officers walked the decks as if patrolling sacred ground. Sailors volunteered to be assigned to the ship, believing it would be the greatest warship the world had ever seen. And for many of them, it would also become their tomb. When the ship was finally launched into the water, thousands gathered along the riverbanks. The hull slid down the slipway with a roar that echoed across the port. Water erupted around the bow as the Bismarck entered the river for the first time. Some described the moment as majestic. Others described it as ominous. But everyone agreed on one thing: nothing like it had ever existed. The British watched carefully, the French worried, the Americans took notes, and the Germans celebrated, believing they had built the weapon that would secure their control of the seas. Yet beneath the celebrations, beneath the speeches and the propaganda, there was a tension that even the most loyal officers could feel. Everyone knew that a ship like the Bismarck was not meant for parades, it was meant for war. The final tests confirmed their fears and their hopes. The ship moved like a predator, silent, powerful, unstoppable. It cut through waves with unnerving grace. Its guns shook the sky when they fired. Its engines hummed with a confidence that felt alive. And soon enough, the Bismarck would leave the fjords to confront the world, to challenge an empire, to seal its fate. But for now, it waited, coiled like a storm on the horizon. The Atlantic had not yet heard its name spoken in fear. But it would.
The North Atlantic seemed to transform as every mile the Bismarck pushed forward into the gray vastness. Strong winds whipped across the deck, and the waves rose in aggressive arcs, striking the hull with the force of liquid hammers. Even so, the ship advanced with an almost supernatural steadiness, as if it had been created specifically for that merciless environment. The enormous war machine didn't just sail, it dominated the ocean. Aboard the ship, the routine intensified. Men rushed between compartments, checking systems, adjusting equipment, calibrating radars, and preparing the guns. The air inside the vessel was a constant mixture of oil, heated metal, and military discipline. Every sailor seemed driven by a nervous energy, as if he knew the entire operation's fate depended on his precision. Captain Ernst Lindemann walked the corridors with firm steps. Unlike most commanders, he didn't just issue orders. He observed, he listened, he felt the ship. Sometimes he paused for a few seconds in certain spots, as if trying to sense silent messages in the vibrations of the hull. He knew that commanding the Bismarck was more than leading men. It was leading a colossal, mechanical entity that demanded respect and understanding. As the Bismarck pushed deeper into the Atlantic, the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen sailed alongside it. On the command bridge, Admiral Gunther Legends remained seemingly unshakable. His rigid face, marked by difficult decisions and absolute loyalty to the high command, revealed no emotions. He was the strategist, and he believed the mission could change the course of the war. Yet, Legends carried a weight within him. He knew the Atlantic was watched. He knew the British Royal Navy was desperate to intercept any German attempt to threaten its vital convoys. And he knew above all that the Bismarck, powerful as it was not invincible. The first hours of the operation were marked by absolute vigilance. The fog was dense, and visibility dropped quickly. In the distance, the sea looked like an endless plain of liquid steel. Radars were checked minute by minute, antennas adjusted constantly. The crew knew that any carelessness could be fatal. During a particularly tense night, the Bismarck faced its first major storm. The
The sky darkened rapidly, and thunder exploded above the ship like invisible cannons. Giant waves rose before the bow, but the Colossus pressed forward, breaking mountains of water with a crash that made the entire hull tremble. Inside the ship, lights flickered as generators fought against the force of nature. Sailors balanced themselves in tilting corridors, clinging to handrails as the ship rose and fell like a titan battling invisible creatures. For some, the moment was terrifying. For others, it was proof that the Bismarck truly was the giant everyone claimed it to be.
When the storm finally relented, the ocean returned to a calmer appearance, but the silence that followed was heavy. The ship breathed, the crew breathed, and deep down, they all knew this was only the beginning. Days passed until, at last, the first significant contact came. It was dawn when an RAF reconnaissance plane was spotted, its distant engine cut through the air like an invisible threat. The alert was immediate. Alarms echoed through the decks, and men ran to their stations. The Bismarck knew it had been seen, and that meant only one thing: the hunt had begun. Across the ocean, the British Admiralty erupted into a frenzy. Messages multiplied through naval bases. Orders were shouted. British ships, scattered across much of the Atlantic, began converging toward a single point, wherever the Bismarck was. The German ship had become the most wanted target in the world. Aboard the Bismarck, tension increased. Captain Lindemann ordered maximum readiness. The sailors knew that at any moment silhouettes could appear on the horizon, and that the first major clash would be inevitable. Then, after hours of intense vigilance, the warning echoed across the command bridge. British ships sighted to the north. On the horizon, two shadows began to appear, first small, then larger, until their forms became unmistakably clear: the HMS Hood, the supreme pride of the Royal Navy, and the newly commissioned HMS Prince of Wales. The crew of the Bismarck felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just an encounter, it was a clash between eras. The Hood was considered the most powerful ship in the United Kingdom, a symbol of strength, tradition, and honor, and it was coming directly to intercept the German giant. The ocean, once just a backdrop, transformed into a stage. The wind carried the scent of inevitability. The guns began being prepared with cruel precision. Every man aboard seemed to hold his breath just a little tighter. On the Hood's deck, sailors also moved with urgency. They knew who they were about to face. They knew the Bismarck was unlike any ship Britain had ever confronted. But courage was a duty, and the Hood had never retreated from a fight. On the Bismarck's bridge, Lindemann watched the two silhouettes approach. He took a deep breath. The moment had come. The battle that would define destinies was about to erupt. Admiral Luches, his expression carved in stone, gave the order that would mark modern naval history: open fire. The Bismarck's giant guns roared like thunder released from the depths. The air shook. The deck vibrated, and immense columns of smoke rose around the main turret. War had finally begun, and there was no turning back. The first salvo tore through the air, crossing the ocean at high velocity, like metal arrows destined to decide the course of history. The British responded immediately, their own cannons echoing across the sea like a deadly challenge. The North Atlantic, silent witness for centuries, now watched an epic duel. Lights, explosions, smoke, and steel collided with brutal violence. And as the Hood approached, with all the confidence of its legacy, the Bismarck, the newly born giant, prepared to show the world what it was truly made of. The meeting between the two titans had begun.
The Atlantic seemed to hold its breath the moment the first shots of the battle echoed. The roar of the guns tore through the cold air like storms of metal, each blast carving momentary wounds into the thick fog that lay heavy over the sea. The duel the world had feared for months, The encounter between Britain's pride and Germany's Titan was finally taking shape, not as strategy on paper, but as fire, steel, and fate. The bridge of the Bismarck vibrated under the impact of its own shots. Men held their positions with discipline, accustomed to the tremor but not to the enormity of the moment. Captain Ernst Lindemann watched through his binoculars every detail of the Hood's approach. The imposing silhouette of the British battlecruiser was advancing with speed and conviction, as if determined to crush its enemy through sheer force of reputation. The Hood was more than a ship. It was a legend. To many Britons, it was the very personification of the Royal Navy, the guardian of the seas, the undefeated veteran that had sailed for 2 decades as a symbol of national pride. But legends sometimes carry invisible shadows. Its armor, though formidable, had weaknesses, and the Bismarck had been designed specifically to exploit them. As the German battleship adjusted its course, the Prince Eugene, lighter and more agile, maintained formation with perfect discipline. The coordination between the two vessels resembled the slow, deliberate circling of predators closing in on their prey. Every maneuver had intention. Every shift in speed had purpose. There was no room for hesitation. On the other side of the battle, aboard the Hood, the mood was entirely different. The British crew advanced with the almost arrogant confidence of those who believed they were fighting not just a battle, but a continuation of their long-standing maritime supremacy. To many of those young sailors, the Bismarck was nothing more than an insolent intruder, a ship that dared challenge the supreme symbol of the British crown. Their hostility was not just military, it was emotional. The exchange of salvos intensified. Columns of water erupted around the Bismarck as British shells fell closer and closer. The deck shuddered. Metallic fragments ricocheted off plates of armor, but the ship held firm. It felt as though it had been built specifically for this exact confrontation.
And then it happened. One of the Bismarck's salvos found its destiny. A 380mm shell pierced the Hood's upper armor, the vulnerable point British engineers had always feared, and reached the ammunition magazines below deck. For a fraction of a second, there was silence. An impossible silence amidst chaos. And then a colossal explosion erupted, lighting the sky as if the ocean itself had been torn in two. A towering column of fire and smoke rose like an instant mountain. The Hood broke in half. The explosion's thunder reverberated for miles, and the shockwave was so brutal that even the Bismarck's crew, despite the distance, felt it ripple through the air. The German bridge fell silent. Even in war, even under orders of total destruction, no one expected this. The Hood, the British giant, the pride of a nation, had disappeared in just 3 minutes. Of the more than 1,400 men aboard, only 3 would survive. The explosion still burned in everyone's minds when Captain Lindemann, his voice firm yet tense, murmured what many were thinking. This was the end of an era. Within British command, the news fell like a fresh wound. The loss of the Hood was not just a defeat, it was a blow to the very heart of the United Kingdom. The Royal Navy, once seemingly unshakable, was overtaken by an almost visceral indignation. The Bismarck was no longer a strategic threat, it was a national obsession. The order was clear, furious, and non-negotiable. Sink the Bismarck. For minutes that felt like hours, the ocean remained in shock. The Bismarck and Prinz Eugen continued their course, but the atmosphere inside the German ship had changed. It was impossible to ignore the moral weight of the destruction they had caused. Some celebrated, others remained silent, and a few gazed at the horizon with a deeper understanding. What had just happened would change everything. And it did. Minutes after the explosion, the Prince of Wales, still locked in battle, resumed firing. Its shells struck the Bismarck decisively. One projectile pierced the bow, compromising the fuel tanks. Another hit internal sections which, though manageable, caused significant damage. The German giant was wounded. In the engine room, the smell of fuel filled the air. Engineers rushed between valves and pipes, trying to contain the leak. The damage was dangerous. The loss of oil not only jeopardized the ship's range, but also left a visible trail on the ocean's surface, a trail that revealed its location to the Royal Navy. And at that moment, the Royal Navy didn't need much to find it. The Bismarck was still a colossus. It still pressed forward with force, but its vulnerability was growing. And with the hood destroyed, Britain transformed the pursuit of the German battleship into the greatest naval hunt of the Second World War. Every British ship available, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, was ordered to chase it. The Bismarck was no longer just a military objective. It was a matter of honor. On the German deck, the crew struggled to process what was happening. Some felt pride. Others felt fear. It was impossible to ignore that the battle had shifted into an avalanche. They had won the first duel, but now they would face a force much larger, much more determined, driven not by strategy, but by vengeance. The Bismarck pressed on, wounded, leading a trail across the ocean, and behind it, like shadows rising through the fog, the Royal Navy began to close the net. The battle was far from over, and once again, the ocean would be its witness.
The Atlantic was darker that morning, as if the sea itself sensed what was about to unfold. The Bismarck pushed forward, immense, silent, and wounded, cutting through waves that seemed to watch the ship with a kind of grim curiosity. Behind it, a long trail of oil spread across the surface like a liquid scar, betraying its position to any enemy who knew where to look. And at that moment, every enemy did. The news of the HMS Hood's destruction had spread through the United Kingdom like an electric shock. In London, radios broadcast urgent bulletins. Naval commanders received messages, accompanied by heavy silence. Entire families wept for sailors who would never return home. But above all, there was a collective decision, a silent promise uniting government, navy, and people. The Bismarck would never return to Germany. Aboard the German battleship, no one doubted that the British response would be ferocious. Yet the routine stayed disciplined. Technicians worked to contain the fuel leak, moving through corridors filled with the sharp smell of oil. Engineers inspected pumps and machinery. Men in the engine room fought against time, trying to preserve every drop of fuel possible. On deck, the cold wind struck the crew directly in the face, carrying not just salt, but tension. Many had witnessed the Hood's explosion. Some could still feel the vibrations reverberating in their bones. The victory had been too brutal to celebrate. It was impossible not to think of the thousands who vanished in seconds, swallowed by the sea. War was exactly that. Massive machines of steel deciding the fate of human lives with almost impersonal violence. Admiral Lütjens remained on the bridge, rigid as a statue. He knew every minute counted. The original plan of Operation Rheinebung was gone. The primary objective was now clear: reach occupied France, where the Bismarck could be repaired and protected by German air squadrons. But the path to France crossed an entire ocean of enemies. As the Bismarck headed south, the Prinz Eugen was ordered to separate. The cruiser, lighter and undamaged, could continue targeting British convoys. It was a desperate attempt to salvage part of the mission. But the split had a deep psychological impact. For the first time, the Bismarck was completely alone.
And that was exactly what the Royal Navy wanted. To the north, south, east, and west, British radars buzzed with activity. Warships executed aggressive maneuvers. Aircraft carriers launched reconnaissance planes that combed the Atlantic like birds of prey. The noose tightened by the hour, and the Bismarck knew it. The ocean, vast and seemingly empty, had become a chessboard, and the German battleship was the most valuable piece, hunted by all the others. By early afternoon, the Bismarck was spotted by a British Catalina reconnaissance aircraft. The blurry image of the ship, captured through the mist, was transmitted instantly to the Admiralty. The effect was immediate. The hunt became more aggressive, more coordinated, more relentless. Aboard the Bismarck, the crew began noticing shapes on the horizon, distant silhouettes moving slowly. They were British cruisers attempting to maintain contact until the larger forces arrived. Direct engagement wasn't yet possible, but the pursuit had become constant. The German ship was being tracked, shadowed, marked. When night fell, darkness did not bring rest. It brought uncertainty. The Bismarck sailed with no lights, trying to hide in the dense shadows of the Atlantic. But its oil trail glistened under the moonlight like an involuntary signature. Inside the ship, men tried to rest. Some slept deeply, exhausted by tension. Others lay awake, listening to the metallic creak of armored plates and the heavy rumble of the engines. The constant sound of the sea striking the hull seemed, to some, like the footsteps of invisible enemies approaching. Then, just before midnight, the tense calm shattered. From the radio came an intercepted transmission confirming the worst. The British aircraft carrier Ark Royal had launched Swordfish torpedo bombers. The attack was on its way. The alarm blared through the ship, echoing like metallic thunder. Men rushed to their stations. Anti-aircraft guns were loaded. Lookouts climbed to high posts with binoculars in hand. The dark, slippery deck filled with activity. In the distance, the faint murmur of British engines grew into a rising hum. The Swordfish were slow, outdated biplanes, almost relics, but dangerously effective. They had crippled the Italian fleet at Taranto months earlier, and now they were unleashed against Germany's largest warship. It was almost ironic, one of the most modern machines in the world, facing aircraft that looked like they belonged to the previous war. But at sea, the most modern does not always win. The one who strikes first does. The attack erupted suddenly, with torpedoes streaking toward the massive hull. The Bismarck's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire with explosive fury, lighting the sky with bursts of steel. The noise was deafening. The deck vibrated under the barrage. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. The planes dived, climbed, retreated, returned, a deadly dance where every maneuver could be the last. The Bismarck turned sharply to evade torpedoes, creating enormous waves that slammed against its own sides. Then, at the height of the chaos, a single torpedo found the exact point it needed. It struck the rudder. A dull, deep impact, almost invisible to the eye, but devastating to the ship's control. The blow jammed the rudder at a critical angle, forcing the Bismarck to turn involuntarily to port, describing wide circles across the ocean. It was the worst possible scenario. Germany's most feared warship could no longer sail in a straight line. On the bridge, panic was contained by strict discipline. Orders were issued rapidly. Engineers attempted to free the mechanism, but the damage was far too severe. For the first time since its construction, the Bismarck felt powerless before the sea. As the crew struggled with the rudder, another sound rose in the distance. British engines withdrawing, returning to Ark Royal. They didn't need to attack again. The decisive blow had already been delivered. The Bismarck was vulnerable, and the Royal Navy knew it. The crew sensed the gravity of the situation. Some men whispered short phrases, others stared silently at the floor. A few still believed in a miraculous escape, but most knew the truth. Their fate had just shifted. The Bismarck circled helplessly in the open ocean, and around it, British warships were closing in, one by one like wolves drawn by the scent of blood. The greatest naval pursuit of World War II was about to reach its climax. Night pressed heavily over the Bismarck, thick and suffocating. The battleship moved in forced circles, obeying not human commands, but the inevitable tyranny of its shattered rudder. The North Atlantic seemed to mock the ship's plight, covering it with dense, hostile waves, as though trying to accelerate the end that approached. The crew, exhausted and silent, knew they were now at the mercy of fate and of the enemy. Inside the engine rooms, the air was hot and suffocating. Yellowish lamps reflected off the sweat of men desperately trying to free the jammed rudder. Tools clattered. Hammers struck steel with frantic urgency. Orders were shouted. But despite every attempt, the result was always the same. The metal didn't budge. The torpedo's damage was far too deep, and the giant was condemned to turn slowly in circles like a wounded animal surrounded by invisible predators. On the command bridge, Captain Ernst Lindemann stood firm despite the crushing weight of responsibility. He stared into the dark sea, searching for alternatives, routes, hope. But each passing minute revealed the same cruel truth. The Bismarck no longer ruled the Atlantic. It was overshadowed by the inevitability of collapse. Admiral Gunther Lütjens stood near him, unmoving, as if confronting reality with a disciplined resignation. There was no fear in his eyes, only cold calculation, the understanding that even if the ship fought to its last shell, the ending was already written. And yet, his voice, when he spoke, carried the full authority of his rank. We will continue fighting, and we will go down as a warship. It was more than an order. It was a vow that no matter how the fates aligned against them, the Bismarck would not surrender. Meanwhile, the Atlantic witnessed the British Armada advancing. Dozens of warships converged toward the German battleship's last known position. Cruisers and destroyers cut through the waves at full speed. The carrier Ark Royal rearmed its aircraft. The battleship King George V advanced relentlessly, accompanied by the Rodney, a floating fortress in its own right. Britain had gathered everything it had to ensure the Bismarck's destruction. This was no longer mere military strategy. It was restitution. It was justice. It was vengeance for the Hood.
Dawn touched the deck just as the first shapes appeared on the horizon. Gray silhouettes materialized slowly, like monsters emerging from fog. The alarm shrieked through the Bismarck. Once again, men ran to their stations. Their hands trembled, but they did not abandon their posts. The deck came alive, or at least gave the illusion of life. Rain began to fall, thin but relentless, making the surface slippery while the wind howled like an ancient chorus announcing the final blow. The scene resembled a tragic painting, the massive, wounded Bismarck surrounded by ships approaching like anxious shadows. The first shot came from Rodney. A thunderous blast tore through the air and the shell landed near the Bismarck, sending up a towering column of water that nearly swallowed the bow. The German battleship answered with its main batteries, but its aim was crippled without steering control. Each shot shook the hull violently, as if the ship itself groaned under the strain. Then the hits began. The Bismarck's superstructure erupted in flames. Shrapnel shredded corridors. Equipment shattered. Men were thrown against steel walls. The devastation was so overwhelming that even the decks trembled, as though the entire structure were on the brink of giving way. The anti-aircraft guns, still functional, were almost useless now. No aircraft approached. The threat was at sea level, and it was overwhelming. Rodney intensified the bombardment. King George V fired continuously. With each impact, pieces of the Bismarck broke away like fragments of a sacred statue being smashed by colossal hammers. German turrets jammed, caught fire, exploded. The deck became a labyrinth of burning wreckage. But even as the devastation mounted, Something astonished the British crews. The Bismarck refused to sink.
Its armor, forged to endure the most violent battles, kept the structure upright, even under an unimaginable storm of steel. The giant remained standing, proud, stubborn, absorbing blow after blow. Inside the ship, conditions worsened rapidly. Fires spread through compartments. The smell of burning oil mixed with heated metal. Men fought flames with buckets, hoses, even their bare hands, as though sheer will alone could deny the inevitable. Captain Lindemann, watching the ship crumble, took a deep breath and remained on his feet despite the constant shudders. "Prepare for the worst," he said, voice steady amid absolute destruction. The British continued firing. The superstructures were demolished. Masts fell like brittle branches. Command towers were reduced to twisted ruins. It was like watching a mountain being slowly demolished by non-stop thunder. And still, impossibly, the Bismarck resisted. But the end was near. Predictable, irreversible. Incapacitated, engines offline, rudder destroyed, guns silenced. Some on board began calling for the unthinkable, scuttling the ship. The idea spread quickly. The Germans had pride. They knew leaving the ship to fall intact into British hands would be a second death, a death without honor. Orders spread, open scuttling valves, prepare internal charges. It wasn't senseless destruction. It was farewell. As the Bismarck slowly began to sink, British fire slackened. Many sailors watched in silence, not celebrating. There was no glory, only the tragic end of a machine and of men who had fought beyond their limits. Water flooded compartments. The hull descended. The bow dipped forward as if the ship were taking a final bow. And then, after hours of torment, the giant began its final descent. Men leapt into freezing water, struggling for survival. Others stayed aboard, disappearing with the ship. Screams echoed briefly, then faded as the sea consumed everything. At last the Bismarck slipped beneath the waves. The Atlantic grew silent again. Germany's greatest war machine no longer existed, and the sea closed over it, like a keeper of secrets. The Bismarck had fulfilled its destiny. Tragic, grand, unavoidable. The war would continue, but something fundamental had changed forever.